a man suddenly shoves an elderly woman in a busy restaurant. The room goes silent, and then, in an instant, someone reacts in a way no one saw coming. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon in a cozy, crowded restaurant. The kind of place where the sunlight poured through the windows just right, and the smell of freshly cooked food made mouth water before the plates even arrived. The hum of conversation filled the room, a mix of friends catching up, couples quietly talking, and families laughing together. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of food, their smiles polite, their steps practiced. Everything seemed calm, routine, predictable. At one corner table, an elderly woman sat alone, delicately holding her teacup. She had a serene presence, quietly observing the world around her. Her eyes wandered from the window to the people passing by, and then to the menu she had folded neatly beside her plate. Every so often, she adjusted her shawl or smoothed out the napkin in her lap. Nothing about the afternoon suggested that it would spiral into chaos. And then it happened. A man, seemingly frustrated over something trivial, moved abruptly near her table. Without warning, he shoved her. It wasn't a violent attack, not in the sense that people might expect, but it was enough to make her teacup tilt, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge. A small plate shifted with a sharp clink against the tabletop. The sound sliced through the air like a sudden note of alarm. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The conversations that had been flowing smoothly just seconds ago stopped mid-sentence. The laughter of children and murmurs of patrons vanished, replaced by stunned silence. All eyes turned toward the corner where the elderly woman had been knocked off balance. Gasps spread through the room like a wave, soft at first, then growing louder, a chorus of disbelief and alarm. The woman blinked rapidly, startled and unsure, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took a cautious step back, trying to regain her balance. Her wide eyes scanned the room, searching for help. Her vulnerability was palpable. She seemed almost frozen by the shock, her small frame dwarfed by the space and by the uncertainty of the moment. The man stood there, tension visible in the tight set of his shoulders, a brief flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected anyone to react. The energy in the restaurant was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. Should someone intervene? Would it escalate? Who will do anything? And then, almost imperceptibly at first, someone moved. A figure rose from their seat with speed and purpose that cut through the tension like a bolt of lightning. Every head in the room turned instinctively, following the movement, a collective gasp escaping as realization dawned. The person's approach was calm, calculated, yet filled with undeniable urgency. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just action. The man's eyes widened as he realized he had been noticed. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Patrons leaned forward in their seats, some frozen mid-chew, others gripping their forks, all watching the scene unfold like a live theater performance. The restaurant, once filled with the casual rhythm of life, had transformed into a stage of suspense. Every second felt elongated, every heartbeat amplified. The elderly woman, still recovering from the shove, looked at the approaching figure with a mix of relief and awe. For her, the world had been reduced to a single focus. The person who had stepped in when no one else dared. The sense of safety that returned with that movement was almost palpable. In a flash, the tension began to dissipate. The figure's decisive action reminded everyone that courage could appear unexpectedly, that ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts in a split second. The man who had shoved her hesitated, unsure, caught in the realization that his moment of aggression had been stopped. Slowly, the hum of the restaurant returned, but it was different now. Conversations resumed, though in quieter tones, and glances lingered on the corner table. The woman steadied herself, adjusting her shawl, taking a careful breath as she regained her composure. Patrons whispered among themselves, recounting what they had just witnessed. Eyes kept darting toward the person who had intervened, admiration and astonishment written across their faces. The restaurant's energy had shifted. What had been a background hum of casual chatter now carried a sharper, more alert edge. Patrons who had only moments before been focused on their phones or menus found themselves replaying the event in their minds, each silently acknowledging the courage they had just witnessed. Conversations had resumed, but every word seemed measured, every laugh slightly tentative, as though people were still holding their breath. The woman, still clutching her shawl, slowly settled back into her seat, but her hands trembled just enough to betray the shock lingering in her veins. Her eyes darted around, not in fear this time, but with a mix of relief and gratitude. She looked at the person who had intervened, searching for words she didn't have. A silent understanding passed between them, a connection forged in a moment of shared humanity, a bond that required no names or explanations. Meanwhile, the man who had caused the disruption had slumped into his chair at a nearby table, avoiding all eyes. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished not by physical force, but by the quiet authority of someone standing up in the right moment. A faint murmur of disapproval traveled through the restaurant, subtle but undeniable, as people glanced at him and then away, unwilling to confront but unwilling to forget. From across the room, a child tugged at their parent's sleeve, wide-eyed and whispering a question that hung in the air. Why did he push her? The parent offered a quick, uneasy shrug, unable to give a satisfying answer, but the child's gaze remained fixed on the scene, absorbing lessons about courage, fear, and human instinct in a single instant. Even the staff seemed changed. The waiters, who had been moving methodically between tables, now walked a little more alertly, scanning the room with a keener awareness. One of them paused near the corner table, subtly checking if the woman was okay, offering a warm, reassuring smile. Her shoulders relaxed slightly at the gesture, and for the first time since the incident, the tension in the room felt almost manageable. Yet, something more lingered beneath the surface, a quiet, almost electric anticipation. Everyone present felt it, the sense that life could shift so quickly, that moments of danger and heroism could collide in ways that left an indelible mark. Some patrons whispered to friends. Others replayed the sequence of seconds in their minds, imagining how things could have gone differently. Each person carried a little piece of the event with them, a reminder that ordinary days could hide extraordinary moments. A hush settled over the restaurant, one that was different from the shock that had preceded it. This was quieter, heavier, like the room itself was processing what had just happened. Patrons instinctively glanced at one another, searching for reassurance, as if to silently ask, "Did you see that? Did it really just happen?" Some faces bore admiration, others disbelief, and a few showed a flicker of guilt, realizing how easily they might have stayed frozen in that moment. The elderly woman's hands, once trembling, now gripped her napkin tightly. Her mind raced, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness of how fragile routine could be. Every step she took from that point forward felt heightened, as if she were seeing the restaurant for the first time through new, sharper lenses. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware, seemed amplified. Across the room, the man who had shoved her sat hunched in his chair, his head lowered. He was still present physically, but his posture suggested a retreat into something smaller, something unspoken. He avoided eye contact, yet he couldn't escape the silent judgment radiating from every table, the invisible weight of accountability pressing down on him. He shifted in his seat, a subtle, nervous movement, but there was no undoing what had already been seen. Meanwhile, the person who had reacted remained composed, though inside, adrenaline still pulsed. There was no boasting, no acknowledgement, only a quiet sense that they had done what had to be done. Their eyes scanned the room briefly, noting the subtle shifts in the faces around them. Relief, awe, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of shame in those who had hesitated. They returned to their seat as if nothing had happened, but the ripples of their actions stretched far beyond their awareness. Even strangers who had been far from the incident found themselves affected. A young couple at a nearby table instinctively clasped hands tighter, their own argument forgotten in the shadow of the moment they had witnessed. An older man at the bar silently shook his head, muttering under his breath, as though reminding himself that civility could vanish in a single instant, but that courage could also appear unbidden. And then there were the whispers, subtle but constant, weaving through the restaurant like a quiet thread. Patrons spoke in hushed tones about what had just happened, speculating, questioning, replaying the details. Each retelling added depth, emotion, and imagination. In that way, the single shove became more than a minor disruption. It became a story, a lens through which the ordinary could be measured against the extraordinary. Outside, sunlight slanted through the windows in golden streaks, painting the room in warmth. Yet inside, the echoes of what had occurred lingered in the air, a tension that refused to dissipate entirely. It was a quiet, persistent reminder. Life could pivot in the blink of an eye, and in those fractions of a second, ordinary people could become witnesses, participants, or heroes. Even after calm returned, something subtle had shifted. Patrons moved with a little more awareness. Conversations carried a slightly different tone, and every glance around the room seemed tinged with a cautious mindfulness. In the corners of everyone's mind, a lesson had been quietly embedded. Moments of bravery exist in ordinary spaces, waiting for someone to notice. And when they do, they leave a mark far beyond the instant they occur.